The pursuit of happiness takes us through an emotional ride and teaches valuable life lessons. The father-son bond is something you cannot give a miss. Find your real happiness and enjoy what you have while still chasing your dreams. "1981 in San Francisco, Chris Gardner, a salesman who sells portable bone density scanners for a living. Every morning he drops his son, Christopher Jr., at a daycare and visits various hospitals in the city to sell the scanner, but no one is interested as it is unnecessary and expensive. Because of that, he asks his wife, Linda, to pick up their kid from the daycare. She doesn't take that well as she's working a double shift. Chris narrates he needs to sell at least 2 scanners a month for rent and daycare, and 1 scanner to pay for his car tickets, which is being towed away by the police. But Chris couldn't sell any for a while. That night, while having dinner, Chris sees a Rubik's Cube, which is a new toy at that time. Linda asks him if he'd paid the taxes, but Chris was going to file an extension. Linda gets frustrated and leaves for her shift. That night, Chris tries to solve the Rubik's Cube and does it effortlessly. Next morning, while Chris is walking down the street, he finds a man stepping out from his sports car. Chris asks him what he does for a living, and the man replies he is a stockbroker. Chris thinks he had to go to a college to get that job, but the man says it's not necessary, but has to be good with numbers and people. Chris finds all the people around him are happy. He questions himself, why couldn't he look like that? Next morning he tells Linda that he would be late that evening, as he'll stop at an office to apply as a stockbroker. Linda finds it ridiculous and humiliates him. He doesn't like it and tells her to never talk to him like that. They have an argument, and Linda reminds him they have 2 months of rent to pay. Chris heads to a brokerage firm to apply. He leaves the scanner to a hippie girl who is performing nearby, as he does not want to go inside carrying it. He gets into the office, and while he's applying for the job, Chris finds the hippie girl is running away with the scanner, causing him to leave immediately after taking the application form. He chases her, but she narrowly escapes by getting into a train. Chris narrates the brokerage firm takes 20 people every 6 months, but only 1 gets the job. Next morning, Chris promises Linda that he will sell the scanner to not see it anymore. He heads to Dean Witter Reynolds with the filled-up application form and personally delivers it to the resource head, Jay Twistle. Chris tries to brief himself, but Jay is in a hurry, so he takes Chris's application and says he will call. Chris finds the hippie girl and her partner carrying the scanner. He angrily chases them. Chris narrates he has spent his entire life savings on those scanners. He calls it a revolutionary machine, but was not aware that doctors and hospitals would consider them unnecessary luxuries. For Chris, losing a scanner is like losing 1 month of groceries. After chasing them, he finally gets the scanner back. His son reminds his earlier promise that he is going to get rid of the scanner, but now he got another one. That evening, Linda sees him bringing back the 2 scanners, and she gets disappointed. They give their son a basketball for his birthday. Later, Chris wants to tell Linda what happened that day, but she does not want to hear it. Next day, Chris meets Jay at the office. Chris tells him about the application form that he submitted a month ago, but Jay tells him he has to go somewhere. Chris takes this as an opportunity and tells him he is going to the same place. They both take the same taxi, and Jay is focused on solving the Rubik's Cube, while Chris is talking about his skills and personality. Jay finds it difficult to solve the Rubik's Cube. Chris says he can solve it, and Jay doesn't believe him. Chris manages to solve the cube before Jay drops off, and he gets impressed. But he leaves Chris behind, and now he has to pay the fare. He gets off the car at a signal and runs away, but the taxi driver chases him. He runs into the train station and gets into a train, but the train door closes on his hand, causing him to leave his scanner. Chris calls Linda to apologize for not being on time, but she is angry as she missed her shift. Linda tells him she is leaving and she is taking her son. He rushes to his house to find his wife and son have left. Just then he gets a call from Jay, who tells Chris to write down his secretary's number so that they can talk tomorrow. But Chris can't find any pen or paper nearby. Chris memorizes the number and goes to a store nearby to write it down on paper. The next morning, Chris confronts Linda at their son's daycare. Linda tells him she's not happy anymore. Chris tells her to go get happy and their son will live with him. That night, the landlord asks Chris for the rent, but Chris asks him for some more time. He tells Chris to vacate in the morning as he got the painters coming in. Chris promises he will pay it soon and he'll paint it himself. The landlord agrees to let him stay for 1 week. The next day, while painting the walls, 2 policemen arrive at home. They take Chris to the station, where he pays for all of his parking tickets. But the police officer tells him they will verify it at 9:30 in the morning. Chris tells them he has an interview the next morning, but they order him to stay until the process is complete. Having no other choice, Chris calls Linda to take care of their son until he comes. He stays that night at the station. The next morning he runs for the interview with his shabby clothes. He arrives at the Dean Witter on time, but the panel is clearly disappointed with his appearance. He tells the panel that he got arrested for not paying the parking tickets. Despite his appearance, he impresses the interviewers and manages to make them laugh. Later, Jay comes to congratulate him, but Chris says he will think about the job, since he learns intern has no salary and his circumstances have changed. But Jay urges him to continue and promises he will fill his spot. Chris heads to his house and waits for his son and wife to arrive. Linda arrives after a while. She tells him that she is heading to New York as her sister's boyfriend is starting a restaurant and she might have a job there. Chris wants to keep his son as she can't take care of him. He then tells her about the internship, for which she got upset and tearfully leaves. The next day, Chris and his son move to a nearby motel. Since it's Saturday, Chris takes his son to play some basketball. While shooting the ball, Christopher says he's going to be a pro. Chris tells his son that might not happen, but he could excel at many other things. Christopher gets disappointed. Seeing that, Chris tells him never let anyone tell him that he can't do something, not even him. Later, they head to the hospital to sell the scanner, and a doctor agrees to buy it, giving him some relief as that money would keep him going for a few days. The next day, Chris heads to the internship to learn about the trade. During a lunch break, Chris meets Mr. Frome while walking down in the street, and they have a general conversation. Suddenly, Chris spots the scanner he left behind at the train station. Chris then chases after that guy carrying the scanner, but he got hit by a car in that process and he has lost his shoe. He returns to the office with a missing shoe. Over the next few days, he keeps doing favors for the office manager, Mr. Frakesh, and tries to get in the clients, but no success. Chris has to leave early for Christopher and has to complete the work in less time. So Chris wouldn't hang up the phone, he doesn't even drink water, so he doesn't have to waste any time in the washroom. Finally, something happens. When a top-level pension fund manager, Walter Ribbon, gives him an appointment and tells Chris to come to his office in 20 minutes. As he is running out of the building, Mr. Frakesh asks him to park his car somewhere else. Because of that, Chris misses the meeting. That night, while eating at a restaurant, Chris tells his son that he will take him along that weekend as he needs to visit a few doctors' offices and sales calls, and they might go to a football game. The following morning, Chris goes to the house of Mr. Ribbon. There, he thanked Mr. Ribbon for the opportunity, although he has missed it. As Mr. Ribbon is going to the football game, he invites Chris and Christopher to come with them. Chris grabs the opportunity and goes with him. During the game, Chris asks him to let Dean Witter manage his funds. However, Mr. Ribbon tells him that he likes Chris, but there is no chance that he's going to accept his offer. Chris pursues his rich friends who are interested and hand over their cards to Chris. One day, the IRS takes some money from Chris's bank account as payment for his unpaid taxes. He got broke with only having $22 in his bank account. Chris asks his friend for the money he owes him, but he thinks it's already paid as he helped them move to the motel. Chris gets frustrated, but he closes the door on Chris. Later that day, Chris took his son to the park. There he notices a man carrying his scanner. Chris runs to him and finally retrieves it. He cleans it well and heads to sell it. A doctor agrees to buy it, but the scanner is not functioning. The doctor still wants to buy it, but tells Chris to get it fixed. That night, they get to the motel to find their things outside their room. Chris tries to open the door, but the lock has changed, resulting in them being homeless, and it forced them to stay in a restroom at a train station. While his son was asleep, Chris cried quietly over their circumstances. Next day, Chris and his son go to a homeless shelter, but get rejected because it's only for women and children. They head to another homeless shelter, and where they almost get cut off when a guy sliced in and steals Chris's spot, because the rooms are already full. Luckily, the security learns that the one in front of them cheated, and Chris gets a room. Inside the homeless shelter, Chris attempts to fix the scanner and studies for the internship exam. Chris even starts to bring in some clients to the firm. On the exam day, he manages to finish it quickly. While leaving, Mr. Frome, who just got out of a taxi, asks Chris to lend him some money. Chris still lends him $5 despite only having a limited amount. That night, Chris and his son end up sleeping on a train. The next day, Chris donates blood for money and uses to it buy a part for the scanner. They get to the homeless shelter and Chris finally fixes the scanner. He then heads to the doctor and finally sells his last scanner, which earned him enough money to survive for 4 weeks. On his last day as an intern, he meets Jay in the washroom. He congratulates Chris for bringing in many clients. He tells Chris that he had done a fantastic job. Later, Chris was called by Mr. Frakesh. He leads Chris to Mr. Frome, who notices Chris is wearing a nice shirt, to which Chris explains he thought it appropriate to dress for the occasion on his last day. Mr. Frome smiles and says he should wear another one tomorrow because tomorrow is going to be his first day. Mr. Frome happily welcomes him to the firm while Chris is trying hard to hold his tears. Chris then thanks the partners and Mr. Frome gives him the money he borrowed. Chris then goes outside the building and narrates that this part of his life is called happiness. He then heads straight to his son in the daycare and hugs him tight, and they both head out, walking together. The epilogue reveals that Chris went on to form his own multi-million-dollar brokerage firm and made millions by selling his minority stake in the firm.